Today on the podcast, we are going to be talking with William Lark, and we have a special guest who is an enterprise change lead, Sarah Duffy. Sarah is going to be taking us through what does thriving in change mean and why is it important? What suggestions do we have for people to thrive in change? What SCARF is? We're going to learn about David Rock. We're going to learn a little bit about neuroscience. And we're going to learn some personal stories. How do we react to change? What's the science behind it? How can we cope with change? And loads more. I'm Elliot Miller. Hope you enjoy. Sarah Duffy is an enterprise change lead here at Seek. Now, I have no idea what that actually means because what even is the title? But I'm super excited to have Sarah on today. Change management is what we're going to be talking about today. What even is change management? So Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm on a mission to help people thrive in continuous change and do change well so that we get the right business and customer outcomes. And to do that at Seek, my focus is creating useful methods, tools, learning experiences so that all of our internal change is done in a way that aligns with our culture and minimises stress in the process. We have 3 programs at Seek now. One is Thriving in Change, which is the topic of today. Another one is how do we lead change and make sure that people feel heard and they understand the reasons for change. And then the other one is Introduction to Change Management, which is the more technical application of change management tools so that we're effectively planning, delivering and evaluating change.
So, and what does that mean, change?
Good question. What I'm talking about is internal change, which is where we make alterations to our work environment that require us to do things differently. So an example of that would be standardizing a work process, introducing new technology, products that our sales teams have to then engage their customers on, changes to structure. So that's been a huge change for us, how we've moved from largely regional teams to being more collaborative and APAC in the way in which we solve our customers' problems. So yeah, there's lots and lots of examples of internal change at Seek, which require people to do things in different ways.
Super interesting. I know we've had a podcast not too long ago with some of the people in KL. And we kind of talked about that. What was it like? What was that specific change like? How have you found talking to people about change and their experiences of it? It's
very varied. As human beings, we are actually hardwired for certainty and control in our lives. Our brains have a complete obsession and love for certainty in our lives. And that's actually been a survival mechanism for us from when we were cave people. And this ability for our brains to quickly detect when things seemed unpredictable or different, and we'd have this stress response to go fight or flight, so I can survive. Now, unfortunately, our brains have not evolved since we were living in caves, but the world around us has evolved, like technology, pandemics. We're living in a world of constant distraction and volatility and change, and yet our brains have not really evolved. So it's no surprise that people might have different experiences with change. Sometimes we can feel really excited and hopeful if the change aligns with what we want at work. And then sometimes we get a bit grumpy because we're like, well, I didn't want to do things that way, or I actually like using this tool that I'm really familiar with. Why are you introducing a new tool to me? So people can have all kinds of different responses to change, and that's part of being human and a survival mechanism where sometimes our brains go, oh, actually, I don't like that. So our brains love that familiarity because everyone's just so busy and running around, and we just want to rock up to work and for things to be as easy as possible. Like at Seek, we deeply believe in people having fulfilling and productive work lives. Well, what does that mean? If you can come to work and you have frictionless experiences, and that really helps. And when we introduce new features or processes or tools, people then have to unlearn how they do things and then relearn. Yeah. And often if it's a really familiar tool, we don't even have to think consciously about it. But as we get introduced to a new tool, you actually have to create new neural pathways in your brain for it to suddenly feel a little bit more in flow. And that's why we get really frustrated, because it's actually the brain feeling that friction within itself, wanting to,
Totally.
Yeah. Things to be seamless.
Something that engineers really need to make sure they keep in mind is that end user, right? And the fact that if you're changing something, it may be as simple as, we're going to throw an error now, as opposed to, trying to figure it out and solve it for the user. It's like if you're changing how something works for the user, they may be used to how your system works, right? They may use the same button a million times a day, and you change the color or you move that. It's like that there is a real world impact to what you're doing.
I led the change stream of unification, where we shipped our Australian-based platform into our Asia markets, which will allow us to innovate and grow faster than we have ever before. But as we did that for our hirers and candidates in those Asia markets, there were things that weren't as familiar to them. And so we had to equip our sales and service teams to be prepared to proactively explain to hirers why are we going about this change, what's in it for you, and also be prepared for inquiries and minimise that through, as you say, making it as user-friendly as possible and having on-demand resources so that if people are like, how do I post this or whatever it may be, they could easily access information in the flow of their hiring process.
Yeah, so how do people get better at understanding change or thriving in change? I heard you say earlier.
Yes, very nice segue. So thriving in change is all about our ability to stay motivated and focused when we face change in our lives. So today's examples I'll use more in a work context, but what I'm sharing can apply change in your life as well, whether it's moving house or, getting married, although that's probably less stressful. But when we talk about thriving in change, as I mentioned, it's all around our ability to stay motivated and focused during change. And that's really important for us because change is inevitable. So in order to work for an organisation like Seek, Seek's constantly striving to improve business and customer outcomes. And to do that, we innovate our product, we improve our processes, APAC ways of working, all that stuff that I spoke about earlier. And so to be effective in a progressive organisation like Seek and many other almost every other organisation for that matter, we need to have the ability to cope in that environment where we're continuously changing. Now, there's two dimensions to that. There's the individual dimension and the organisational dimension. So for individuals, it's what you spoke about earlier, our ability to have self-insight and regulate our emotions in those moments where it would typically trigger a stress response. Why is this changing? That's not cool. Like that's a completely human response to change and kind of bypasses our rational thinking. But how do we catch that in the moment and ensure that we actually regulate those emotions so that we can be more productive and also not create stress to those around us? Because if we're really frustrated, people can feel that as well. We cast a shadow as individuals and organisations. So individual ability to thrive in change, but then organisations also have a role to play in helping individuals thrive in change. An example of that is because our brains are obsessed with certainty and control, organisations play a role in creating certainty during times of disruption and change. So how do they communicate to people in a really transparent and clear way? And they reduce jargonistic words so that everyone can understand what's happening around us and what are the reasons for this change. Giving people agency, just like that example you gave earlier, where we may not have control over changes, but we may be able to have a voice and feel heard around how do we get supported through this change. And ensuring people have a voice is also really important because it makes them feel valued and heard, which is another human condition that many of us need. So that's another way that we can improve our ability to thrive in change by looking at it at the individual level as well as the organisational level. What role does the organisation play in creating an environment where people have maximum certainty, agency, and a sense of worthiness during change?
Can you give us some examples that you've done here at Seek?
Yeah, sure. So a really lovely example was unification, where we were introducing a huge amount of change to our sales and service teams across 6 countries. And essentially they went home on a Friday having used very familiar systems in how they manage their customers, the products and how that they sold to customers and the features of that product were really familiar. So they went home on a Friday and then they came in on a Monday and it was all new. It was a new world. New customer management system, new way in which we build our customers, new product. And so we needed to ensure that those people felt as confident as possible when they came into the office that they could cope in this new environment. How did we do that? Well, firstly, we ensured that they had a deep understanding of the reasons for the change and what it would mean for them. So ran lots of workshops, in-country conversations, and we equipped leaders. We had about 200 leaders across those 6 markets. Yeah, a lot of people. And because we knew that it couldn't be done through broadcast communications, people wanted meaningful two-way dialogue on the ground in their local language as well. And so we equipped about 200 leaders, brought them in on the change journey much earlier than their team so that they could understand what was happening, the
so
timeline.
They could get comfortable with it as
exactly.
well, right?
They had time to process it. We showcased the changes, like a day in the life, how it would change for their teams. They were able to ask questions, get a real sense of the product and system. Another cool activity that we did was we ran a Shark Tank process where leaders and other influential people were invited to present to a Shark Tank, which was a group of executives, around how they would pitch the change to our customers and what objections they might anticipate. And by going through that process, the leaders had a sense of ownership and agency in how we would communicate the change. And so through that, they learnt a lot, but they were also more committed through that process of being involved in the process rather than just getting, a pack and saying, go forth and deliver this change.
Yeah. I've always kind of wondered about that, like how you get buy-in from people when it comes to change. Because, often we want to improve things, like add new features or change the way we develop software or, structural changes to team or processes or whatever, trying to get the buy-in from people so that they actually want the change and then they kind of push it themselves.
Have you heard of the IKEA effect?
Oh, yeah.
I have not. What is the IKEA effect?
We love it more if we made it. So it's a motto that we introduce in our new change training, which is a concept of co-creation. So people are more likely to fall in love with an idea or support a change if they have been involved in the process of developing the change. Now, that's not always possible. Let's say you're introducing an off-the-shelf tool. People don't really have much of a say in what that tool looks like if it's a standard off-the-shelf product. But you could involve them in the process of saying, all right, well, we're introducing this new tool. Let's run some focus groups with representatives of impacted teams to say, well, how are you feeling about it? What will help you use this tool? What will get in the way? What are some options to support you, whether it's training or showcases? And that process of involving them in thinking about how they'll prepare for the change will increase the likelihood than them perhaps rocking up to a session and being like, well, this is how you're going to have to do this.
Sounds like you kind of have to start higher up and get people comfortable with the change. And then team leaders are then making their team feel more comfortable and so on and so forth, right? Because I guess it'd be hard to make change feel comfortable if your leaders aren't comfortable in it as well.
Indeed, yes. We are social creatures and we get a lot of our cues around whether we should support something based on what everyone else is saying and doing. So if you can get the right amount of influential people, typically leaders, but it could be, long-standing team members that have a really strong voice, those really influential people, if you can get enough of them actively supporting your change, that adds a rocket to your change process. And as change practitioners, we know that. So we often include things which we call change champion networks, where we will identify leaders and key influencers that represent the functions that are facing the change and involve them as early as possible, just like that unification example, because they're the ones that are going to rocket the change process, not a change manager sitting in head office who's not familiar or known to the people on the ground. Yeah.
Interesting. That's why there are influencers. That's why that became a job, because it's effective and it works. You have people who have influence saying, hey, this thing over here is really, really good. And then people go, oh, well, if X thinks it's good, it's probably good. So,
yep. Exactly. A lot of the principles that we apply in contemporary change management is learnt through just behavioural science, which is applied in marketing and product design. So even though we talk a slightly different language, friends, we also kind of solve similar problems just with a different customer.
How many people are quite comfortable with change in your experience? And how many people do you see who are just like, no, I do not want to do this? How do you kind of get around that?
So it depends. It depends on the change.
The classic answer.
I know. It's true though. It depends on what's changing. For example, organizational change can, just the word itself, when people hear about that, can trigger a stress response, especially if we don't have all the information in front of us. Will we have our jobs? Who will my new leader be? Creates a lot of worry for a lot of people, even if the change isn't that big, because of our association with org change and what a lot of other organizations are doing, particularly during harder economic times. Whereas if it's a change like unification, where we're like, well, we're introducing a better tool, we're introducing world-class systems, we're like, yes, this is great. It's going to be a huge career opportunity for me to learn these skills. So we didn't face as much resistance. So yeah, it does depend. What can you do? The more you can make your change brain-friendly, the better.
What defines brain-friendly?
Brain-friendly change is about, well, firstly, understanding what our brains need during this change and what might be triggered. So there's a guy called David Rock who introduced the SCARF model, which is our underlying social needs that can get triggered or stressed during change. So they're things like status. If you do an org change, your role title might change, or you might change in the hierarchy. That can be stressful for people and elicit a stress response. So how do you make sure that they feel valued and heard, even if their title might change? Certainty. So this is a really big one. How do you give people a sense of certainty through really clear communication? And even if you don't have all the answers, giving them certainty around the plan. So I can't tell you exactly what this change will mean for you, but I will tell you next month or next week. That helps give people a sense of certainty and predictability about the future. Having an appreciation for given the change we're facing into, what might trigger a stress response to people based on the natural human needs, and coming up with strategies to reduce those stress responses. An example of that is I've been involved in lots of org change over my career, and we often use the SCARF model as a reference around, well, how do we ensure that we give people meet their needs through this process, including how their leaders engage with them during the change, and look at that at an individual level.
And what is the SCARF model?
The SCARF model is the model by David Rock around what are our underlying social needs that might be rewarded or threatened during change. And so it stands for our need for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I recently ran a workshop with our marketing function, and everyone shared their SCARF results, which was really powerful. And then we did a show of hands just to get a sense of where people were in terms of their dominant SCARF needs. And by doing that, it highlighted that we're all different, and difference is okay. It's not wrong, but having an appreciation that people have different needs during change means that they might have different responses, and it's not good or bad, it's just different. And how do we anticipate that so we can minimize stress for them during change? So we did a show of hands, but one of the cool things we noticed was there was a strong need for relatedness and fairness across the entire function. So now we know that when we embark on change in the future, how do we ensure that when we're introducing change, people feel that, the process is fair, and relatedness, that they have an opportunity to feel a sense of connection and belonging and care during that process. So, yeah, it can be a very, very insightful tool.
One of the notes I had here was a good night's sleep. How does that kind of play a part in this?
True. So, yeah, what I've just spoken about is probably more what organizations can do or change practitioners can do to help people thrive in change. But there's also things that we can do as individuals. And sleep's one of them. So our ability to cope with change is essentially how we treat our brain, because our brain is the thing, the muscle that helps regulate our emotions and our feelings and thoughts and responses during times of change and uncertainty. Have you heard of sleep hygiene?
I have not.
No, I have not.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah,
No.
so there's a really great TED talk on it. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but as soon as I watched it, I was like, oh, wow, I've got some basic things that I can do to improve my sleep hygiene, which is essentially creating the conditions for you to have a good night's sleep. Minimizing device time before you go to sleep is really important. I have not had a phone in my bedroom for 5 years now. It helps that I have a 5-year-old, so she's my alarm clock. But even when, it helps having a natural alarm clock, but making sure that you keep devices away. Another thing is making sure that you have a regular sleep routine. And it's really, I don't know if you see this on LinkedIn. I often find myself unfollowing these people because they just like trigger rage, but they're like, I'm a CEO. Let me tell you how I'm successful. I basically sleep 4 hours a night and, I wake up at 3 a.m. and exercise and then I work till 11 and then blah, blah, blah. And you're like,
Sounds awful.
Yeah.
sounds hideous.
I check my email while someone else brushes my teeth.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Must be nice to have somebody to brush your teeth for you, unlike the rest of us plebs doing it ourselves.
Exactly. But yeah, these people often define success by, the fact that they work all day, work out, and then get a few hours sleep. It's actually not true. Most people need a minimum of 7 to 9 hours rest in order to help themselves function well. So how do you create the conditions for a good night's rest? Another technique that is really useful is if you find yourself ruminating, it starts to trick your brain into thinking that bed is where you work. So getting out of bed, if you haven't fallen asleep within like 20 or 30 minutes, get out of bed. I get a piece of paper and a pen and I just get everything out of my head. Usually it's all the things that I haven't done, all the things that I'm planning on doing the next day. Put that on a piece of paper and then eventually my brain's like, that's better. And then I can go back to bed and actually have a good night's rest. But if you don't do that, then your brain's like, oh, okay, I'm here to work. And
if I write it down, then I can be like, it's okay, it's there. I'm not going to forget now because it's written down on my Slack or my reminder or whatever.
Yeah, it works.
That one really resonates with me.
They're the kind of hacks that you can do to create better sleep hygiene. One thing I wanted to share, being aware of what are the things that you can do to increase your capacity to thrive in change is really important, and appreciating that sometimes you can't do it all. So there's another amazing researcher called Hilary Scarlett who wrote a book on the neuroscience of change. And she is really passionate around how do we apply the theory of neuroscience into the real world and help people and organizations be effective from a change perspective. And she's got this framework which is called ACCESS. So I spoke about SCARF. This is ACCESS, which is easy to remember. And she talks about, kind of 6 conditions, which is acknowledge, calm, challenge, exercise, social, and sleep. I won't talk about all of them in detail, but there's 6 techniques that you can use to increase your capacity to deal with change, and sometimes one of them won't be available to you. So, for example, when I was 25, I embarked on a really significant change in my life. So I was working for a management consultancy in Melbourne and volunteered to help set up a business in Perth. And it was pretty exciting. I was going to work with my mentor, new market, we'd be working on new customer problems. And then, new change, new me, so exciting. And then about 3 weeks in, I got a call from the executive of the firm who said, Sarah, we're going to finish your rent because we actually need you to work over in Canberra to do a major operating model implementation for an energy business over there. And suddenly I had this sense of agency and focus on my personal growth to all this change happening around me. And I couldn't access all the techniques that would help me cope in change. I couldn't exercise because I was working long hours. I didn't have a support network because I was over there and I didn't know many people. My sleep was down the toilet because I was living in hotel rooms with lots of unnatural light. But the one thing I could do was stay calm through deep breathing. And so my mum, who's a yogi, which is a really well-practiced yoga person, taught me this technique called box breathing or square breathing, which you can look up online. But it's a really terrific way to take control when you're facing stress responses and through deep breathing and holding your breath and then slowing down what we call your parasympathetic system, which is just basically a fancy word for saying your stress response and irrational thinking. And by doing that, I was able to better cope with the change and uncertainty that I was facing at work. So yeah, that's just an example where sometimes you can't use all the techniques available to you because life is not that easy, but how do you find the things that will work for you in that moment of change? In those moments, and that's what I love about box breathing, you can do it at work. Like I was really conscious of the fact that I was struggling at work. I didn't want to make a big deal about the fact I wasn't coping with all the change around me. But I could sit at my desk, and in those moments where I felt like things were spiraling out of control, I could literally sit at my desk and just do my square breathing, which is, to explain it to you, imagine you've got a square in front of you. And what you want to do is you want to inhale along the top of the square, and then when you get to the pointy end, hold your breath as you go down. Imagine go down the side. Then you exhale, and then you hold your breath until you get to the top, and then inhale. There's some better visual representations on...
Wow, given we usually have a monitor or a laptop in front of us, that rectangle's a pretty apt...
So the top and bottom of the square is where you breathe in and breathe out, and the sides of the square is where you're holding your breath.
And you can do it going for a walk. You can use it anytime, anywhere. And, we were talking about kids before. I often use that when they're driving me nuts. I'll just turn away and do a few
I hear you there.
Square breaths.
Maybe I should do that at work more when I'm frustrated with X NPM package not working properly.
You mentioned that you weren't around people during that time to help you feel comfortable in change. Is connecting with people and that a big part of thriving in change?
Absolutely, Will. Yes, it's another one of our human conditions, relatedness, or feeling a sense of connection and belonging, which is part of David Rock's model. Yeah, during times of change, when you think about it, if you see an organisational announcement, your natural response is, who can I talk to about this? It might be a corridor conversation, or you go out for a coffee. Just the knowing that other people are experiencing something with you is really good. And especially if those people are good listeners, so that you can have like a really open conversation and, you just feel understood. That's really important, which is why in our new Leading Change program, we talk about the importance of care as well, and how leaders need to appreciate the different responses that people can have during change and how they demonstrate care through kind of leaning into those conversations and actively listening. But, we can all be leaders. Leaders not about having a direct team. It's a choice we have around the impact that we want to have around us. So David Rock, one of the best things you can do, because, I'm a big believer that...
He's a bit of a rock star, is he?
He's a total rock star.
Lame joke inserted.
I'm fanning out on this rock star, David Rock. So his firm, Neuro Leadership Institute, you can, if you Google SCARF assessment, you can get their free self-assessment of SCARF, which will tell you what your dominant needs are. And by having that self-insight during times of change, you can go, why am I feeling this way? Which of my SCARF needs might be threatened? And just by being aware of the triggers and emotions that you're feeling, you can then start to regulate them. So that's a really terrific tool that's free and on the internet. Hilary Scarlett, so I learnt about her through reading a book called The Future of Change Management, which is not very expensive but incredibly insightful. But she also has a book called The Neuroscience for Organisational Change, an evidence-based practical guide to managing change. I haven't yet read that, but the chapter in The Future of Change Management is awesome and covers the access approach.
Interesting.
Yeah. As companies grow, if you're an engineer in a startup, you usually kind of have free reign to do whatever, right? But as companies grow, there will be significant change that happens to the org structure, to the processes, and coping with that can sometimes be a real struggle. But then you've got simple stuff like changing teams, or well, I say simple, changing teams or changing technologies or changing languages that you're programming in. And I think people can have that knee-jerk reaction that change is scary. I'm used to working in C#. It's like, what if I go over to Java, what if I don't know anything anymore? And maybe that imposter syndrome kind of comes out a bit about like people will know suddenly I don't know anything about my job and this and that. So
yeah, that's really, really common. And something that we think about when we're doing big technology changes, that people can often place a sense of value and worthiness with having deep expertise in something. So when you're throwing out the old and introducing the new, how can you help them feel valued and experts? And so an example of how we do that is inviting them to end user testing. We say, we really value your deep subject matter expertise in using the old platform. We're introducing a new one. Come and have a play and let us know what you think. And again, that's a really nice example of co-creation where they're actually being involved in the change process and sharing what they don't like, where are the bugs, and then they've got a bit of a head start as well to really understand and adopt the new piece of technology. It's completely normal for people to feel that way and also just feel frustrated because they're having to learn new things and it doesn't feel as natural to them as those, their brains forming the new memories about the new system or whatever.
What happens if change happens but it doesn't happen well? Or maybe it's a business decision that rolled out and we realize it didn't work and we have to then, I don't know, make people now or to be like, all right, now you're comfortable with the change, well, we're going back to how it was. How do you deal with change that goes wrong?
Oh, yeah. Well, nothing ever goes perfectly well. I think it starts by acknowledging early on to manage expectations that this is going to feel a little bit like a roller coaster. We're going to have to learn a lot along the way. We're going to face, some bumps, some ups and downs, and just managing people's expectation that it ain't going to be perfect. And even if the solution's perfect because we're learning new things, it's going to be frustrating at times. So I think always managing that it's not going to be smooth sailing is really important. Trying to iron out any issues early on through co-creation, whether that's testing, contributing to what does the new process look like, how do we ensure that this is a smoother transition as possible, like what support do we need to give people? So co-creation is a really important one, but even then things can go wrong. I think it's just really important to acknowledge people's experience in those moments of failure. Like people know things go wrong, but rather than sweeping it under the carpet and being like, oh yeah, well, that was fun. Let's go back to the old ways of doing things. Like that will make people pretty grumpy. So just being a bit vulnerable and saying, you know what, we stuffed up. We've actually since realized that we're going to have to revert back to the old way, or we're going to have to spend more time fixing this up. It's really, really important so people feel that their needs are heard and that their experience is acknowledged.
Definitely getting comfortable with change is a skill, but also I'm sure sometimes that hesitance towards change can help you as to help understand what the impact of that change is, right?
Yeah.
Are we doing it the right way? Is this
Yes.
I don't know, that feedback is probably a good part of change and managing change.
100%. In the traditional change management models used to say resistance was bad and you needed to find a way to stop them from resisting. And more contemporary change models say, well, actually, human beings have natural stresses during change. If you find a way to continuously listen and see that as a source of insight, you'll ensure that the change is more successful. And one of my own experiences with that was my first change gig. And we were rolling out a massive technology and process change across all of our departments in Australia. I remember there was one guy who was seen as just more of a naturally skeptical person. And we did a change readiness survey to get a sense from all the leaders and key influencers how well they understood the change, how supportive they were of it. And this particular individual had a more negative response. And so I kind of thought, all right, this is my chance. So I picked up the phone and I was like, oh, I didn't know that you knew it was me. I said, well, of course, because the intent is to find these sources of insight, like what is the root cause or the concern, so I can pick up the phone and get a real sense of what's on your mind. And so then we had a really, really great conversation around his worries around his team being absolutely smashed by the change because those in manufacturing roles found it harder to do classroom-based training just because of their learning styles and the fact that they were more kind of on the tools sorts of people. And he was like, when they do the training, they're going to go back to the manufacturing side, but they won't remember everything. And so then they're going to come to my team, the technical team, and ask them heaps of questions. And I don't have enough resources in my team to actually cope with that amount of inquiry management and mentoring. Like, how are you going to help? So I was able to go, oh, that's so true. You know, we need to reflect the local nuances that you're facing and the different learning requirements. And so we had a good chat around, well, what are some options to ensure that his team had the capacity and people were trained in the right modes. And I fed that back to the training team. So by doing that, I then moved from someone being skeptical to supportive, and he was able to communicate that to his own team, who were also probably a little bit worried about that. But also I was able to improve the change plan by using that insight and sharing it with those that were having to improve the plan. So rather than going, oh, that guy's so annoying, all he does is give us bad feedback, it's like, actually, I think there's some truth to this. And it was really, really valuable. So yeah, listening is really, really important, Will, and that's something that we do at Seek. How do we build those mechanisms to continuously listen during change?
Some of this stuff has honestly been a real eye-opener for me because, you know, there are changes that I've seen. A change was made at an organisational level. A very important person sent out an email blast about, we're doing this now. This is the new way X thing is going to work. That filtered down and the, you know, people at the very bottom were like, I don't like that. Or, you know, they started doing that thing and then it was like, yeah, this sucks. It was just like, we're just doing this now. There was never a consultation for them. They were never able to voice, but what about this? But what about this? But what about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's like one of my things, like you can't do change via email or broadcast announcements. Yeah. If you need people to do things differently or if it's going to be, you know, unpopular, you can't just blast out an email and ask people to change. It's one of my passion projects to turn that around and make the shift from telling people to change to having conversations about change. And sometimes that's not always practical, but, you know, in that example, let's say before the announcement came out, they actually gave the team leaders a heads up, hey, we're about to communicate this change. We think your team members might have questions. Here's a few, you know, messages and responses that in your back pocket. So when it goes out and your team members might mention this in the corridor in team meetings, the leaders can actually listen to them, make them feel heard, but also provide a little bit more context rather than an email where people go, what the? And then they don't have a place to share their concerns, or their leaders are like, well, I know just as much as you. You know, that's not great.
how does someone become an enterprise
change lead? Yeah. So there's not many of these roles around. They, you know, ASX listed organisations, normally, you know, they might be called heads of change, but there's probably not a lot of these roles around. How people normally get to this sort of a role is they do change management first. So they're a change manager in an organisation. And the best way to be a change manager is to volunteer for projects that involve change and look at what sort of strengths you can bring to that, whether that's, you know, you're really good at planning or you're really good at facilitating workshops. Change management is not something that you typically do a course at university on. So I started my career as a business analyst in a strategy firm. I realized I was more interested in people than numbers. So then I went into an HR consultancy, then went into industry was like a head of learning and development. And through that, I was like, I got seconded to lead a major change program. And that's where I was like, I love this. I get to apply everything I've learned around human behavior, leadership, communications, but I'm doing it in an environment like a project that's like high pace, high pressure, customer impact. So the project work is where you get that real exposure and opportunity to apply the skills. If you work at Seek, come and do our change management introduction programs or our leading change programs. That's also another way to kind of build your skill. And away you go. But, the cool thing about this is you don't need to be a change manager to practice great change management. So, hopefully today people have got some useful techniques and tips to make it happen.
Awesome. All right, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to have you back again to talk more.
Yeah, absolutely.
See you later.